getting mixed up. Hello everybody, this is Ben Knight. I hope you can hear me clearly. If you've got any problems with sound, put a message in the chat group and we'll try to advise you. So welcome to the next webinar as part of the Better Learning Leadership Network. Thank you for joining us. I think it's one of the great values of joining this network is to, first of all, to get some insights from Cambridge, but also to hear your views and opinions and comments on what we're presenting. In case you've missed some of the previous talks or papers, do check into the platform where we keep all the information, and I'm sure you'll find some interesting things there. So what I'm going to do now is hand you over to our speaker, who is Niall Curry, who is a senior ELT research manager at Cambridge University Press, and he's going to talk about developing speaking skills in the ELT classroom. Over to you,
Niall. Thank you, Ben. And thank you, everybody, for coming today to listen to me talk a little bit about some of the research that we're doing here at Cambridge University Press surrounding speaking skills and ELT. So I guess just to give a little context, where this research has come from was a survey that we did with about 14,000 students, where we asked them a number of different things. And one of the questions that we asked them was, what do you find most difficult in English? And given the nature of this presentation, I don't really think you need to guess what the answer was. So speaking ranked highly. So where this came from was we didn't give them a set of options to choose from. We let them write in what it was that they taught. So they might have said speaking, talking, conversation, and then we collected all of these that overlapped together. And we saw that speaking ranked really highly among the difficulties that students had around learning languages. And I think any of us who have worked in ELT don't find that too shocking as a statistic. And when we look a little bit more closely then, the kind of information that we were getting from students were things like this quotation here. The teacher is the leader. Not many queries are asked by students during the class. And so it's confusing when we're out in the open and supposed to speak to strangers. So this is, I guess, reflecting the idea that what's happening in the classroom, the students didn't necessarily feel was preparing them for what they had to do when they used English in the real world. And there were other implications for the classroom from this study. So we saw that there was a reluctance of students to participate due to fear of being judged. We saw that students saw that there was a dominance of stronger students and that made other students feel bad and, again, less likely to participate. There was also, I guess, a lot of reticence around this idea of working with peers, working with the students who are learning the language as well, and they didn't necessarily see the value, thinking that they needed to have a native speaker model, they needed to have somebody who was fluent and perfect in English in every way, which, again, is one of those ELT fallacies in many ways. And then there was I suppose, issues surrounding topics, and that they weren't necessarily motivated by the topics or the activities that they were doing in class. And so this led us to consider a couple of different areas of research. One was around near peers and the idea of looking at how we can use our peers who are learning English with us, who have learned English before, in order to motivate us to be better language learners. We also looked at research surrounding this idea of a safe speaking environment. So how is it that we create a safe speaking environment? What is a safe speaking environment, and what does it do for language learning? And then we also looked at the language itself. So looking at how we learn language, how we can motivate students to learn language, and how we can create context for language learning is really important. But I think it was also important that we look at the language of spoken interaction. So for example, conversation. And this again comes from another area that we're particularly interested here at Cambridge University Press, surrounding conversation. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of these three areas of research, hopefully then kind of trying to illustrate the kind of things that we can take from this research that we can use in our everyday practice surrounding English language teaching. So starting with near peers. So what is a near peer? Well, near peers are not only people who are similar age, gender, nationality, and culture, but they tend to share educational and professional backgrounds and a common goal, such as language learning. So near peers aren't specific to language learning, but they present, I suppose, a powerful tool, a powerful resource for language learning. And research in the area has shown that exposure to near-peer role models can result in immediate benefits to motivation, excitement, risk-taking, and the amount of English used. So effectively what this means is that if we identify a peer who is close to us in a number of ways, including our ambition to learn a language, our ambition to improve in some way, and we can see them improve, that can help motivate us and make, I suppose, the language learning more realistic for us. We can see it happening in other people. And what we see is that in stressful contexts, near peers can offer each other support and reassurance, and they can often give feedback that teachers cannot, such as the perspective of someone who has recently taken a language exam. So we can all imagine a situation in classes where our students are taking exams and a student who has recently taken an exam telling other students about what it is that they went through, how they prepared, and how it felt is, I guess, information that they would value, especially from someone who they can relate to in some way. And what this means then in terms of near peers is facilitating classes through strategic pairing and grouping of learners. So, for example, we could have near peer language role models. And this is where we see a student who's very much like us, who has maybe a slightly better grasp on a particular area of grammar, or maybe they're particularly good with vocabulary. And what we can do is we can think about pairing students who want to develop that skill in order to help each other out. But it's not all about language. We might have students who have maybe not got necessarily as good grasp on elements of grammar, but have really, really good learning strategies. They know how to address their weaknesses. They know how to do things for language learning that maybe other students cannot. And they can help each other in terms of helping support language learning. And I guess the other idea could be something like creative. So I think in most classes, we might ask students to imagine something, to come up with their own kind of country rules for their own island, things like that. And some students really struggle with demonstrating creativity, and this can also be culturally bound in some ways. So identifying students who have a strength in that, and then strategically pairing or grouping students that have this relationship as peers, but can help foster the development of creative thinking in others can be quite valuable. And so I think that looking at near peers for the language classroom can have many more implications then in terms of the ways that we do this, we pair and group the students. And I guess we have to think about the pedagogical rationale behind that pairing. This, I guess, puts the teacher in a position where they have to reconsider their role somewhat, where we can see that we need to think about the value of seeing the peers as opportunities and resources for learning. And here I've mentioned a little bit about accessing this idea of the ideal L2 self. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on the theory behind all this today. This comes from an area of sports psychology, the ideal future self. And it's about imagining a version of yourself in the future who has succeeded at the thing that you want to succeed at. So often it would be about people in the sporting arena imagining themselves on a podium or getting an Olympic medal or doing something like that, and they picture that so that they use that as a motivation so that they can one day fulfill that dream and feel the feelings they imagine they would feel. And researchers like Zoltan Dornier have transferred this over to language learning, where we talk about the ideal L2 self and imagining a future version of yourself who speaks English or speaks a certain language the way you want to speak it. And the value of near peers in this is that they're evidence for you that you can do this. You can see them improving and you can see them developing, and you can see how that could work for you too. And I think what's crucial here, and this refers back to some of the points that were made earlier in the presentation, that of the students, I suppose, reticence around interacting with peers in the classroom, is that we need to train our students to understand and exploit the value of their peers better. And I'll come back to more the advantages of peer interaction a little later in the presentation. So near peers in the language classroom lend themselves to, broadly, developing learner autonomy. So students can work together and they can figure out how to learn from one another. And it takes, I suppose, a little bit of focus off the teacher, perhaps in classroom contexts where there isn't as much time for teachers to be as involved. It also leads to the development of metacognitive skills for language learning, which is quite crucial in terms of strategy development surrounding language learning, test taking, and overcoming, I suppose, weaknesses in your approach to language learning. And it can reduce this affective filter in the sense that it creates an environment that's quite collegial, that's quite supportive, and can be more enjoyable. So that was near peers. The other area of research that we were interested in was the idea of safe speaking environments. And these two areas aren't necessarily distinct of one another. I think that they correlate quite well, which is why in terms of like psycholinguistic and pedagogical research, we often look at the kind of issues surrounding the context for language learning. And so a safe speaking space in the context of language learning is an environment in which time for speaking is valued not simply as time for extra practice of previously learned material, but as a time in which new learning opportunities come to life. And so we see a safe speaking space as a space that treats people who inhabit it as cherished resources. So we see the students as resources, similar to the point I made about near peers. They engage students' identities, their future visions, their hopes through immersive tasks. They're responsive to students' agency by honoring topics that are close to their worlds. They take seriously all the human relationships that are central to all communication. And in safe speaking spaces, in terms of feedback, they focus both on linguistic features or meaning, and that feedback is given in service to the students' communicative accomplishments, so that it's meaningful, as effectively as what that means. So these are the criteria of safe speaking space, and I'm going to talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail now. So when we talk about time for speaking, we talk about interaction as a means of language learning, so that we're not considering time for speaking as a time for language practice, but time for speaking as a time for language learning. So in this research surrounding safe speaking spaces, we see that through speaking, learners can develop conversational competencies. So this is the kind of interactional skills, I guess, that students can use, and that students can use beyond the classroom. And again, I think this refers back to some of the issues that the students made during or professed during the survey, that they weren't necessarily able to use the language outside of the classroom, or they felt stifled in doing so. Students become more proficient in the use of appropriate rather than just accurate language. So I guess this idea about figuring out how interaction changes when you're dealing with different people, different contexts, and different purposes. It'll deepen their understanding of difficult concepts. So this is to do with procedural knowledge and procedural memory, and that if we have time for speaking included in the classroom, the process of performing the language can deepen their understanding of difficult concepts. It also expands their analytic abilities in that they're evaluating and analyzing in real time in response to the information that's being presented to them in the class. And this type of critical thinking and evaluative skills is hand in hand with language learning, where we see that higher order thinking skills like analyzing and evaluating are attributed to better language learning. And they push each other beyond their current individual capacities. So students working together, speaking together in classrooms, they can push each other to do that a little bit more. And so what we see here then is this idea that time for speaking is so much more than a practice of something that was presented earlier in the class. Time for speaking is creating time for learning. And it's a time in which learners can play with language and they can take risks with language. One of the other core tenets of safe speaking was the idea of creating immersive speaking environments. So environments where language is quite broad. We can look at where students are making things, they're solving a problem, they're discussing issues, narrating stories, sharing opinions and experiences. When we're creating an immersive environment, it's important to think about the level of challenge, the relevance, the task orientation. I suppose the keyness is the idea of the student involvement. which has to be at the core, so that we can create these immersive speaking tasks that will allow them to switch into the use of language in a way that they will become unaware, I guess, of what it is that they're doing and become so engrossed in the task. This then has massive implications for intrinsic motivations in language learnings, where students are now no longer thinking about performing tasks and using language in a way that's going to be well received. They're thinking about using language to do something, and that they're enjoying their ability to be able to do something with language. So it becomes less of a display of language skills and more of a use of language. When we think about learner-centered content then in Safe Speaking, what we are thinking here is that we want to include learners and want to ask them to draw on their own lives and experiences as input, ways of personalizing content. We want to center around themes that interest learners. We want to link to the classroom content to the outside world. And we want to give students choices on what to focus on and push them to do more with each task. So this idea is that when we are creating tasks or creating opportunities for students to use tasks, that the learner is always at the center. Then we might consider designing content around the learner, and then we choose engaging topics to bolster that. So effectively what we see here then is the idea of personalizing learning. And what this does then is it encourages students to share, to engage. I suppose looking at these few points that I've discussed so far in Safe Speaking, we have things like learner-centered content, we have things like time, and we have things like immersive speaking tasks. And I guess what you might be seeing right now is that these are not necessarily separated from one another. These are all overlapping in some way, because the Safe Speaking context is one context that relies on all of these things to kind of organically work together, which, when I said earlier about teachers having to reconsider their role, it by no means means that teachers will be doing less. I think in this perspective, we can see that the teacher has quite a task ahead of them to create a space that does all of these things. I said I'd come back to peer interactions. Interesting with peer interactions, learners in peer-to-peer contexts get to talk more. So that's clear from the research that is presented on peer interactions, that they get to speak more often than they would when they talk to teachers or native speakers. And they also tend to exhibit much greater complexity in their language, because they're experimenting with language, they're taking risks, and they're making mistakes, which we know are core elements or core criteria for successful language learning. And this is also largely due to not needing to display certain things. Often in an interaction with the teacher, for example, they may want to demonstrate the language that has just been taught. And that can often be at the cost of previous knowledge that they could be compounding. So in peer interaction, learners get to do that a little bit more, and I guess they feel less inhibited. So creating a safe space for speaking among peers can have positive effects on language learning anxiety, and increased motivation. But I suppose a caveat to all of this is that it's not necessarily about just creating one or sets of peer interactions in any way at all. I think we need to be quite considerate of how we do that. And on the left there, it might be difficult to see on this, but if we share the slides around, you'll see the interactions on the screen. We have situations where, if we have a collaborative situation, it could be two people who are both, I guess, quite equal in terms of their speaking and listening skills, and they can engage. And on the very bottom, we have examples of skills exchange where it's expert novice, and it's where the expert is perhaps stronger than the novice, but the expert is also willing and aware to help the novice teacher or the novice student develop, and the novice student is willing to learn from the expert learner. What we have in the middle then is situations where students might talk at each other, or one student might talk and one student might listen. And they reflect some of the negativity that we heard in the survey surrounding dominance and difficulty. So strategic pairing and figuring out ways that, and this comes down, I think, to individual classrooms and individual learners, figuring out how to do that and who's going to help who. One of the last points here on safe speaking was the issue surrounding feedback. So we looked at ideas surrounding feedback, whether it's the teacher giving the student feedback, or is it the student giving the student feedback? And should we give positive feedback or corrective feedback, or positive and corrective feedback? And things like that. And there was no very clear answer. What became clear is that it was important to align the feedback with pedagogical goals. So where it was in the interest of the teacher to give the feedback, it was important that they do it. But for students to give each other feedback was very valuable too in achieving many of the things that I've already discussed, in creating time for speaking, creating peer interactions, the use of near peer role models, things like that. And feedback is quite complex in that sometimes what we think might be the right thing to do may not in fact be the best thing to do in the language classroom. For example, I have here quite counterintuitively, positive assessment, like very good, can actually inhibit speaking by allowing students to think they've done enough, whereas feedback as an invitation to elaborate can be more valuable for encouraging more speaking in the classroom. So giving feedback, but pushing students on to do that little bit more. So this is, I'm going to leave that for now. This is what we've known so far. We've studied so far about near peers and about safe speaking. And effectively what this is doing is drawing from research in education and research in psycholinguistics to try and figure out how people can effectively learn languages better, how we can make room for more opportunity to develop speaking, and what does the research say about how people do that. And what we wanted to do to support that was also to take a look at the actual language. And for today, I've decided to focus on conversation. The reason we're focusing on conversation is that one of the areas of interest or areas of research that Cambridge University Press has worked in for many years is corpus linguistics. And we have many different corpora and subcorpora. We have a corpus of English that is nearly 2 billion words of lots of different types of conversation. Included in that is a very recent database that we collected in the UK, the Spoken British National Corpus 2014, which is about 11.5 million words of spoken language. And not just all spoken language. This is very focused on casual conversation, everyday conversation, conversations between friends, between peers, people at home, things like that. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to find out the type of language people were using like nowadays in everyday spoken contexts. And the reason we wanted to do that is that we wanted to talk about how we could teach conversation. And what we saw from the research surrounding conversation is that most talk is organized around action sequences rather than topics. So what this means is we don't necessarily teach, when we're speaking, we don't necessarily, it's not necessarily centered around one topic. It's often centered around something that we're trying to achieve in the conversation, some type of function, some type of exchange. And when we look at the research from areas like conversation analysis for language teaching, we say that sample conversations, whether they're authentic or a bit simplified or even scripted, they should ensure that natural turn-taking practices are accurately reflected. So how can we show turn-taking? And this would shift a focus away from structures of language to structures of practice. And so what this means is that we're not necessarily thinking as much as about the present perfect continuous, what it is that we're trying to achieve here, but thinking about what is it that we do in conversations that makes them conversations, and what is it that we don't do that would make them not conversations. So what are the features of conversations? And so we did a little work on that. So what we want to do is we want to find a way to expose learners to as much relevant or varied and creative language as possible. And this is one of the core tenets of language learning and creating optimal conditions for language learning, that learners have access to varied and creative languages, or language rather. And so we looked at this idea of MiniLogs. And so MiniLogs are these small conversations, extractive conversations that contain relevant language. And in these MiniLogs, what we see are things like turn taking, how people end a turn, how people start a turn, how one person might start speaking and another person might interrupt them and start speaking, and what kind of things people are doing. And so we wanted to look and see how this works and doing a little corpus search and on turn taking, we saw things like yes/no questions that feature are rarely answered with a straight yes or no. So if someone asks you a yes/no question, you will very rarely see somebody saying yes or no. Often it's mitigated with something like well or some kind of pause or hesitation. Things like yeah and yes have more interactive functions than they might seem, so they often can show agreement or encouragement, so it's not necessarily just an affirmative. I don't know can be multifunctional, so it doesn't necessarily have to hold its semantic meaning of just saying I don't know something, but I don't know can be a way of showing disagreement, or it can be a way of I guess encouraging speakers to carry on. Here I've listed it as a turn initiator, so it's a way of taking the floor off somebody, or the way of interrupting somebody and starting to speak. And we also saw a lot of use of what were called response tokens. So this idea of showing listenership. So for example, if I was in a room with you giving this presentation right now, you might be nodding, and that would be a minimal response token. So indicating that you're listening in some way. Here, I guess, when you're writing up on the chat messages, this is a type of response token in order to let the speaker know that you are listening. And so these are features of language that maybe reflect the kind of issues that learners were having, where they were saying that they weren't necessarily seeing or getting access to the type of language that they need when they go out into the real world. And these are the kind of things that we can glean from corpus research that we have done. So what I have here then is just a little graph to try and summarize what it is that I've talked about here. And the idea is about developing skills and language for speaking in English. So the core ideas is to see time for speaking as time for learning. So that way we're making time for using English, spoken English in the language classroom. That we want to think about our interaction patterns, including using near peers in a purposeful way and with reason. So this is about making sure that they're pedagogically guided. We want to think about learner-centered content and how it is that we can modify or adapt content in order to make it personalized. And this doesn't necessarily mean that things need to be changed drastically, just figuring out ways to make it that bit more personal. Thinking about feedback and who should give the feedback, when we should give the feedback. All of this is, I suppose, very valuable in trying to create a space where students feel safe to speak. At what moment is the right moment to give this type of feedback? Exposing learners to relevant and varied language so that they will feel equipped for when they leave this safe space to enter into the world and use the language that they've been learning. Because creating a safe space for practice and learning is good, but we also need to equip them for the language beyond that space. And when teaching speaking, that we think deeply in that we're not just teaching speaking, but we're teaching conversation, we're teaching public speaking, we're teaching interview skills, and we're teaching the language that reflects in that. And I just have a little summary here. What we know from research is that students not only practice language when speaking, but learn it. We know that speaking needs to be prioritized in the language classroom, and that although it is complex and composed of considerations of time, task types, learner-centeredness, peer interactions, and feedback, speaking can allow students to immerse themselves in relevant and personal language that can facilitate language learning. Focusing on varied uses of language can make this more accessible, and looking at the generic features of genres of speaking, like conversation, can be particularly valuable. So in terms of near peers, what this does then is it helps us look at learners and how they can take agency for their own learning. And they can learn from each other, recognize their strengths, their weaknesses, and different types of learning. Safe speaking looks at what the teacher can do to facilitate, monitor, and guide learning through expert and effective classroom management techniques. And the language of speaking genres, through corpus research like conversation, the learner is exposed to different conventions of speaking in different contexts and can learn skills for conversing, public speaking, and presentations. And together, the learner's psychological, pedagogical, and linguistic needs are catered for. So that is everything that I wanted to talk to you about today in terms of developing ELT speaking skills in the ELT classroom. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I know there was a discussion going on there, but I wasn't able to follow as I was going through.
More people commenting on things, not questions.
Okay. Oh, that's a good question. Can one get a student to become a near peer? Yeah, I suppose it is. I mean, what a near peer is somebody who is a role model to somebody else in some way. So if a student is particularly good at something, has a particularly good way of learning vocabulary, is very aware of strong test preparation activities and know what they can do in order to improve in some way, and there's a particular student that isn't, pairing them up in some way to let them, I suppose, make them aware that they can help each other out, or they can share their knowledge, could be quite useful. I guess the near peer role model, what's so important is that they're close enough so that we can see it as a possibility. So, for example, I guess this often comes from arguments surrounding the native speaker model, and whether or not that's even something that we should be guiding people towards. And where students see a native speaker and think that's what they want to be, that can be, I guess, in a sense motivating, but it's also a very, very difficult to achieve something like that. So finding a way to give them milestones so that they are not necessarily trying to jump too quickly, because it takes a very long time, as we all know, to become proficient. So I think that's what the key is there, to figure out a way of creating milestones, and that they can see how they can help or learn from somebody else just like them, who has already done something like this. I'm just kind of looking through the questions. Do observations in your research apply to different age groups? Yeah, so broadly, actually, it's taken from quite a few different areas. So a lot is to do with secondary and adult education, because it's often quite easier to get access to learners in those contexts. But issues surrounding kind of like the stresses of language learning and language anxiety that things like near peers can be valuable in attenuating, they often come from young learner contexts. So it's quite a spread, although I would say that more coming from adult and secondary contexts. I guess that's not necessarily something that we need to think. I'm looking at the question, how do you assess the performance in near peer conversations? Really, I guess it's the proof of the pudding is in the eating, whereas what we want to think about here is, what is the outcome? If the students are working together and they're helping each other and they're developing in some way, and you can see that this pairing is beneficial, then and the student is happier, the student is more motivated and more engaged, then I think we can see a benefit to using near peers. If the students pretend to be more motivated, is that what you mean? I guess I think when it comes to your own individual classes, monitoring, like somebody had said there, Soraya had said, I think monitoring is obviously one of the ways that we can get that kind of information to figure out whether or not something is working successfully or not. But I do think that it's one of those things where, for near peers, what we want to see is that they're more motivated, more engaged, and that they're being constructive. And I think that kind of brings us back to the idea of how the teacher's role might change a little bit there. Some of the support that the teacher might try to give initially might be easier to get from a learner than it would be from a teacher. Would you recommend adapting speaking conventions to students' levels in the CF4, I guess? Recommend adopting speaking conventions. Okay, that's a good question. So that's surrounding the corpus studies. So that's quite difficult because what these features are kind of often like non-words, or they're words that you can learn from a very early age, or an early level rather. Things like I don't know, or yeah, or yes. You know, if you look those up in a kind of language profile, you'll see that those feature very early on. So with something like that, I think what comes into play here is how frequently they'll be exposed to something like that, and how problematic it could be for them if they're out in the world and don't know it. So I don't know that it's as easy to map these smaller conventions in terms of the language items that they are, to CF4. It's to do with, I guess, the student's ability to hold a conversation. I think initially these things are often better taught as in terms of perception, not necessarily having to perform the language that's doing them, but understanding how to interpret them when they're being presented. I have another question here. What if we put that conversation into dialogue form as a record so that their writing skills could be addressed? I mean, I think that's a really good idea. And I think it's about drawing attention to the difference in the genre. So what's important in looking at that little dialogue is that represents spoken language, and this isn't necessarily something that we would write, although perhaps it would be if we think about the language of social media, where that tends to be somewhere in between written and spoken language, and this kind of thing could be useful for that. But I absolutely think getting it to work with more skills, it's definitely not a bad idea at all. No problem, thank you. Was there another question?
No, I think those are all the questions.
Super.
Okay, thank you very much, Niall. That was really interesting. Lots of great ideas and some good conversations in those questions at the end, and also during the talk as well. So just to remind you that if you need a certificate of attendance for this webinar, we've just put it across, we've dragged it across so you can see it there, and you can download the file on the button there. It'll download it. You can just put your name in and print it off. So I think that's everything. I hope you found that useful, and keep your eyes open for the next event that we organise. Okay, thank you very much now. Thank you.